Welcome to the deep dive. We are really thrilled to have you here in the room with us today.
Absolutely.
Whether you are a medical student prepping for boards or a junior doctor trying to connect those clinical realities to larger systemic forces,
Mm.
or, a public health trainee looking to solidify your conceptual frameworks, you are completely in the right place.
You really are. And today's deep dive is structured as a direct companion to the Oxford textbook of global public health.
Right.
Specifically, we're diving deep into two massive, really foundational pillars of modern population health.
Which are huge.
Yeah, they are. The first is the macro-environmental determinants, so climate change. And the second is the micropopulation intervention, which is population screening.
It's an ambitious pairing for sure, but
Yeah.
a totally necessary one.
Exactly. And the mission today isn't to simply read the textbook to you or just, regurgitate facts.
You can do that on your own.
Right. This is a structured conceptual deep dive. We really designed this to clarify the underlying frameworks, strengthen your clinical and public health reasoning, and support your active reading of those specific Oxford chapters.
Yeah. We want to emphasize differentiation, like hazard versus risk or incidence versus prevalence, and reinforce the kind of systems thinking that explains why public health decisions are actually made in the real world.
To do that effectively, we need a central overarching metaphor to anchor all these concepts together.
Right, the radar. I want you to picture public health as a vast, dual-layered early warning radar system. That is our primary framework for today.
It's a great way to look at it.
The first layer is the macro radar. Think of this as upstream engineering. We are scanning the deep horizon for massive structural threats.
In this case, we're looking at climate change. It's a scenario where the Earth's atmosphere itself becomes a primary health determinant.
Exactly. Then we have the second layer, the micro radar. This is population screening.
Right, so instead of scanning the atmosphere, we are scanning the immediate population to detect hidden hazards inside seemingly perfectly healthy individuals.
Both radars are all about early warning, but they operate on vastly different scales.
They rely on different mathematical models.
And they carry entirely different ethical burdens. Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the macro radar, the environment and climate change.
To really grasp the impact of the atmosphere on human health, we have to start with the physics of the planetary blanket.
The framework of exposure leading to system impact.
Exactly. The Earth's baseline temperature relies on a really delicate radiation balance.
If we were to, say, strip away all the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere,
If we just had oxygen and nitrogen,
right, the Earth would be roughly 30 degrees Celsius colder than it is today.
the average surface temperature would hover around minus 15 degrees Celsius.
Which is wild to think about. We would essentially be a frozen rock.
A completely frozen rock. The greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, act as a selective barrier. They're transparent to the high-frequency incoming solar radiation. So the light comes in, hits the Earth, warms it.
And the Earth radiates that thermal energy back out as lower frequency infrared radiation.
But those gases trap the infrared radiation.
It's the classic greenhouse effect, like a car window on a sunny day. We absolutely need that blanket to survive.
We do. But we are stuffing the blanket with an incomprehensible amount of new down feathers.
Let's look at the actual exposure data on that. Human activities are pumping roughly 27 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere annually.
27 gigatons.
To give that number some physical weight, 27 gigatons is the equivalent mass of 3 million Eiffel Towers.
Injected into the air every single year.
Every single year. And this isn't a gas that just dissipates overnight either.
No, the longevity of carbon dioxide is a crucial mechanism to understand when you're evaluating system impact. About 50% of the carbon emitted today will be absorbed by natural sinks.
The oceans and the terrestrial biosphere.
Right, within about 30 years. But 20 to 30% of it will remain in the atmosphere for centuries.
Centuries. By 2014, atmospheric levels exceeded 400 parts per million.
And if we consult indirect measures, like ancient ice cores, those present levels are higher than at any time in the last 400,000 years.
That timescale is just hard to wrap your head around, 400,000 years. Yet, when you walk outside today, the air doesn't instantly feel like a furnace. There's a real disconnect between the atmospheric data and our daily sensory experience.
What's fascinating here is how the ocean actively masks the severity of this shift from our surface level perspective.
It's a massive buffer.
It really is. Over 80% of the additional solar energy trapped by these greenhouse gases has been absorbed by the upper layers of the ocean.
So the ocean is functioning as a massive thermal heat sink.
Exactly. Its sheer thermal mass is delaying the atmospheric heating. If the ocean wasn't absorbing that heat, the atmospheric warming we experience on land would be orders of magnitude more severe.
The true extent of the planetary warming is essentially hidden underwater.
It is. And that brings us to a concept that causes a lot of public confusion: shifting the curve.
Right. We constantly hear discussions about a 2 to 4 degrees Celsius global average increase. To someone outside of public health, that sounds trivial.
It sounds like the difference between wearing a light sweater and a t-shirt.
Exactly. But in our field, we have to differentiate between hazard and risk. Why does a tiny shift in the mean matter so much?
Because a global average temperature is just the peak of a normal distribution, a bell curve.
Okay.
When you raise the global average by 2 to 4 degrees, you aren't just making every single day exactly 2 degrees warmer.
You're shifting the entire bell curve of temperature distribution to the right.
Yes, and statistically, when you shift a normal distribution curve even slightly, you massively multiply the area under the extreme tail end of that curve.
I see. So it's not the new average that kills people, it's the widening of the variance. We are creating entirely new extremes that literally didn't previously exist on the graph.
The variance is where the mortality lies. Human infrastructure and physiology can cope with modest, slow increases in baseline temperatures.
Sure.
But extreme heat waves, those tail-end events that historically happen maybe once a century, they suddenly start happening every decade or every few years.
The hazard is the heat, but the risk is the exponential increase in the frequency of those extreme events.
Precisely.
A tragic illustration of this tail-end risk is the 2010 Russian mega heat wave.
That was devastating.
It wasn't just a hot summer, it was a prolonged extreme temperature anomaly that resulted in an estimated 50,000 excess deaths.
50,000. And we see the baseline shifting in real time. In the Western United States, record highs now outnumber record lows by 3 to 1.
It used to be a balanced 1-to-1 ratio.
Right. The atmosphere is fundamentally altering the baseline conditions for human survival.
Which forces us to look closely at pattern recognition in epidemiological data.
If you plot temperature against mortality across different global cities, the resulting graphs almost universally form a U-shape or a J-shape.
Let's visualize that U-shape for a second. The bottom of the dip is the optimal temperature. It's the environmental sweet spot where mortality in that specific population is at its absolute lowest.
Right. And as you move left toward colder temperatures, the mortality line climbs.
And as you move right toward hotter temperatures, the line climbs again. But that optimal sweet spot at the bottom of the curve changes drastically depending on geographic location.
It really does. Consider Harbin, a city in the far north of China. The mortality rate there is at its lowest when the average temperature is near 0 degrees Celsius.
Wow. 0 degrees.
Their optimal physiological and societal baseline is essentially freezing.
Contrast that with Sao Paulo, Brazil, or Mexico City, where their optimal temperatures are much higher.
The overall shape of the mortality curve remains consistent, but it shifts horizontally based on the context.
That suggests an incredible capacity for human adaptation. We clearly adapt physiologically, and we adapt socially to our specific environments through our architecture, our clothing, our daily routines.
We do. But that adaptation has hard physiological and structural limits. And this is a really critical takeaway from the U-shaped curves.
The right-hand arm of the curve.
Yes, the arm representing extreme heat. It often rises much more steeply in cooler locations.
Because a population in a typically cool climate lacks the structural infrastructure.
Like ubiquitous air conditioning.
And the physiological acclimation to survive sudden massive spikes in heat.
Exactly. Therefore, a sudden 35 degrees Celsius heat wave in Paris will produce far more excess mortality than the exact same temperature in Mexico City.
Because the Parisian environment is simply not engineered to buffer that specific thermal shock.
It's the shock to the unacclimated system that does the real damage.
And speaking of system shocks, we need to examine the climate multiplier effect on vector-borne diseases. The historical context in the textbook is actually fascinating here.
It goes back a long way.
Patrick Manson published the first major textbook on tropical medicine in 1900. Even over a century ago, he explicitly recognized that climate wasn't the sole causative agent of these diseases, but it was a strictly necessary condition for them to thrive.
Manson understood vector biology deeply. Climate acts as a massive multiplier for vectors like mosquitoes.
The mechanisms are well documented. Higher ambient temperatures reduce the extrinsic incubation period of viruses within the mosquito.
Meaning the time it takes for a mosquito to become infectious after biting an infected host drops significantly.
Furthermore, higher temperatures increase the mosquito's metabolic rate.
They feed more frequently, they bite more hosts, and that drastically amplifies transmission efficiency.
The epidemiological data maps this perfectly onto global weather patterns, specifically the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, in the Pacific.
The ENSO cycle fundamentally alters trade winds and ocean currents every few years.
And the La Niña phase of this cycle brings warmer and significantly wetter conditions to the South Pacific.
When we cross-reference weather data with epidemiological surveillance, the La Niña phase perfectly correlates with massive dengue fever outbreaks in island nations like Fiji and Samoa.
The climate shifts, creating optimal breeding conditions. The vector population explodes, viral incubation drops, and incidence just spikes.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The textbook presents a highly counterintuitive paradox regarding drought.
Right, because we typically associate mosquito breeding with heavy rainfall and standing water. But drought conditions can actually trigger massive outbreaks. How does a lack of water lead to more mosquitoes?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a perfect example of why public health cannot simply model the weather. We have to model human behavioral responses to the weather.
Okay, walk us through that.
During a drought, natural standing water dries up. But humans still need water to survive. Consequently, populations in drought-stricken areas begin hoarding water.
In unscreened storage pots and barrels in and around their homes.
Exactly. By trying to survive the drought, humans inadvertently construct artificial, highly concentrated mosquito-breeding microhabitats immediately adjacent to where they sleep.
The behavioral adaptation itself creates the hazard. That highlights one of the most notoriously difficult challenges in global public health attribution and forecasting. How can we definitively prove that a changing climate caused a specific outbreak?
We can't just put a weather system in a lab.
Right, so how do we do it?
Direct attribution of a singular event is nearly impossible. Instead, public health utilizes risk-based attribution.
This is the exact same epidemiological framework utilized to establish the causal link between smoking and lung cancer.
Precisely. We cannot definitively prove that one specific cigarette caused a specific mutation in a specific patient.
However, we can prove through robust population data that smoking increases the probability of developing lung cancer by a massive, quantifiable margin.
And we apply that exact same probabilistic reasoning to climate events.
The textbook uses tick-borne encephalitis, or TBE, in the Baltic states as a prime case study for this complexity.
In the early 1990s, the incidence of TBE surged dramatically across the Baltics.
From a pure climate perspective, the region was experiencing warming trends that resulted in milder winters,
which extended the active tick season and increased tick survival rates. That is the climatic determinant, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
Because that climate shift coincided exactly with the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yes. The geopolitical collapse led to the abandonment of massive collective agricultural farms.
And these untended lands quickly transformed into overgrown habitats.
Habitats perfectly suited for rodents and deer, which are the primary hosts for the ticks.
Simultaneously, the resulting economic crash plunged populations into poverty,
forcing many individuals to forage for food, like mushrooms and berries, deep within these increasingly tick-infested forests.
So the climate shift primed the biological weapon, but the socioeconomic collapse put the human population directly in the line of fire.
It's an incredible lesson in confounding variables.
And when we try to forecast the future using the global burden of disease models, those confounding variables become honestly terrifying.
The World Health Organization modeled the disease burden attributable to climate change in the year 2000 against projections for 2030. They looked at direct heat deaths, malaria expansion, and natural disasters.
Yet, the condition projected to cause the highest number of disability-adjusted life years, or DALYs, in developing nations wasn't heat stroke or infectious disease.
It was malnutrition.
Let's define DALYs briefly for anyone new to the metric because it shifts the entire perspective.
It's not just about raw mortality. It's a measure of overall disease burden, representing the number of years lost due to ill health, disability, or early death.
Why is malnutrition the dominant driver of those lost years?
Because agriculture, unlike a factory, is an open system completely exposed to environmental variance. A shift of a few degrees combined with altered rainfall patterns leads to widespread crop failures.
In developing nations with fragile food security, agricultural failure translates directly to catastrophic malnutrition,
And malnutrition stunts childhood development, impairs cognitive function, and severely weakens the immune system.
which in turn multiplies the mortality rate of every other endemic disease, from diarrhea to pneumonia. It is the ultimate cascade failure.
The macro radar is flashing red across the board. The threats are clearly identified.
So, how do we engineer a public health response? This brings us to the framework of upstream engineering, specifically differentiating between mitigation and adaptation. Let's make sure our definitions are rock solid here.
Mitigation represents primary prevention. It targets the root cause by cutting the emissions of greenhouse gases to slow or stop the warming trajectory.
Whereas adaptation is secondary prevention.
Right. It acknowledges that a certain degree of warming and environmental disruption is already mathematically locked in. It focuses on building structural and societal resilience to cope with the changing baseline.
Let's examine a textbook adaptation case study. We previously mentioned the 2003 European heatwave that resulted in roughly 15,000 excess deaths in France alone.
Just 3 years later, in 2006, another severe heat wave struck France.
Based on the catastrophic 2003 data, predictive models anticipated a 60% jump in mortality. Yet the actual mortality rate only rose by 14%. That is a massive discrepancy. What happened?
Epidemiologists debate two primary theories. The first is structural adaptation. Following the trauma of 2003, the French government implemented rigorous early warning systems, established cooling centers, optimized healthcare mobilization, and aggressively educated the public on hydration and checking on elderly neighbors.
The society adapted.
Exactly.
And the second theory is much darker. The depleted pool of susceptible individuals.
Yes. The grim reality is that the 2003 heat wave may have already killed the most vulnerable members of the population. The extremely frail, the isolated elderly, those with severe comorbidities.
Consequently, by 2006, there simply were fewer highly susceptible individuals left in the population to succumb to the thermal stress.
In all likelihood, the dramatic reduction in mortality was a combination of both genuine systemic adaptation and a tragically altered demographic baseline.
A more uplifting case study in resilience compares Hurricane Katrina in the United States with the hurricane response in Cuba.
In 2005, Hurricane Katrina, a Category 3 storm at landfall, caused roughly 1,000 deaths in a highly developed, high-income nation.
Conversely, between 1998 and 2002, Cuba was struck by 4 different hurricanes ranging from Category 2 to 4 severity. The total death toll across all 4 storms was 12 people.
12 people.
How does an island nation with a fraction of the GDP achieve that level of resilience?
It is a masterclass in upstream public health engineering and social capital. Cuba's resilience doesn't rely on expensive technology. It relies on deep community engagement.
They possess highly organized civil defense systems with localized, decentralized stockpiles of supplies.
More importantly, their primary healthcare system is deeply embedded within the neighborhoods. Local physicians know exactly who the vulnerable individuals are.
The bed-bound, the oxygen-dependent.
And they ensure their early evacuation.
Compare that to the Katrina response, where marginalized, lower-income communities were largely left to navigate the crisis without adequate structural support, transportation, or communication.
It strongly suggests that baseline social equity and community cohesion are the ultimate forms of climate adaptation.
Adaptation is crucial, but it cannot replace mitigation. However, the textbook offers a stern historical warning regarding reckless mitigation strategies.
If we implement green policies without public health oversight, we risk repeating the 4 Ds of the 19th century industrial energy revolution.
Disruption, deprivation, disease, and death. Transitioning global energy systems causes massive socioeconomic upheaval.
A modern example of this is the biofuel crisis. The idea was to reduce fossil fuel dependence by devoting agricultural crops, like corn, to produce ethanol.
It sounds like a great mitigation strategy on paper.
But the downstream system impact was severe. By diverting massive quantities of food crops into the energy sector, global grain prices spiked by roughly 30% between 2000 and 2007.
We attempted to solve the energy crisis by inadvertently escalating a food security crisis,
directly increasing the risk of that same malnutrition we identified earlier as the primary future driver of climate-related disease.
Mitigation cannot be balanced on the backs of the poorest populations. We need interventions that solve both problems simultaneously. We need the co-benefits of climate mitigation.
How do we reduce carbon emissions while generating immediate, measurable improvements to human health? The sources provide some brilliant blueprints.
Consider the New Zealand housing trial. They initiated a program to comprehensively insulate low-income homes.
The primary environmental goal was to reduce energy consumption for heating, thereby cutting carbon emissions.
Yeah, that was successful, but the public health co-benefit was staggering.
The insulated homes were significantly warmer and drier, which led to a massive, statistically significant reduction in asthma-related school absences and pediatric hospital admissions.
Then there is the transport modeling out of Delhi. Delhi desperately needs to cut emissions to combat lethal air quality.
Planners evaluated two main pathways: subsidizing a massive switch to low-carbon or electric vehicles versus heavily investing in infrastructure to support active transport.
Meaning safe networks for walking and cycling.
The models revealed that while transitioning to low-carbon vehicles certainly reduces air pollution, shifting the city toward active transport yielded 10 times the overall health benefits.
By facilitating walking and cycling, you aren't just clearing the smog, you are fundamentally altering the baseline physical activity levels of millions of people.
Driving down the incidence of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes.
Finally, we have to look at short-lived climate pollutants, specifically black carbon, commonly known as soot.
Black carbon is a potent warming agent because it darkens snow and ice, causing them to absorb rather than reflect solar heat.
However, unlike carbon dioxide, which lingers for centuries, soot falls out of the atmosphere in a matter of days or weeks.
This presents an incredible mitigation opportunity. If we aggressively target black carbon emissions by upgrading highly polluting diesel engines and banning the open burning of agricultural waste, we could avoid an estimated 2.5 million premature respiratory deaths globally every single year.
While simultaneously achieving an almost instantaneous cooling effect on the atmosphere, it is arguably the most efficient win-win scenario available in global environmental health.
It really is.
Well, we've spent the first half of this deep dive scanning the horizon. We've looked at massive universal environmental forces shaping population health from the outside in. But now I want to completely shift our perspective.
We are going to recalibrate the radar.
If climate change is the massive storm system on the macro radar, population screening is the highly sensitive micro radar.
We are no longer looking up at the atmosphere. We are looking inward into the hidden biology of the individual.
This transition from the macro to the micro requires a fundamental shift in our ethical and operational frameworks.
With the environment, we are trying to shield populations from external hazards. With population screening, we are actively reaching into a population to uncover internal, individualized, and often entirely asymptomatic threats.
To do this responsibly, we must establish strict definitions. We must clearly differentiate systematic screening from routine case finding or opportunistic testing.
Let's draw that line. Case finding is clinical. It's an ophthalmologist checking a known diabetic patient's eyes for retinal damage.
That patient is already sick. They are already in the medical system.
Opportunistic testing is when you visit your general practitioner because you sprained your ankle, and while you're there, the nurse happens to check your blood pressure.
But population screening is an entirely different beast.
Population screening is a systematic, programmatic public health service. It is proactively offered to a defined demographic of people who consider themselves to be in perfect health,
Who exhibit zero symptoms of the disease in question.
and who have not sought out any medical advice.
This raises an important question. That proactive invitation creates an incredibly heavy ethical burden. When the state or a health system formally invites a healthy person to undergo a medical test, there is an implicit promise being made, isn't there?
There is a profound implicit promise. The promise is that by participating in this screening program, we will materially benefit you.
We will detect a hidden pathology early enough to alter its natural course and significantly improve your ultimate prognosis.
Because we are the ones initiating the intervention on healthy individuals, the ethical mandate to do no harm is absolute.
If a sick patient seeks treatment, they accept a certain level of risk and side effects to cure their ailment.
But if a public health program tells a healthy person to take a test, and that test causes intense psychological trauma, unnecessary invasive biopsies, or debilitating elective surgeries for a false alarm, we have fundamentally violated the ethical contract of public health.
To ensure we don't violate that contract, we have to rely on the mathematics of the microradar. This brings us to the framework of incidence versus prevalence and the crucial statistical measures of sensitivity and specificity.
These terms often get tangled up, so let's break them down clearly.
Sensitivity is a measure of the radar's ability to catch the true positives.
Right. If exactly 100 people in a room actually have a disease, a highly sensitive test will correctly flag all 100 of them. It casts a wide net and ensures no sick person slips through.
Specificity, conversely, is the radar's ability to clear the true negatives.
If 100 people in a room are perfectly healthy, a highly specific test will correctly identify all 100 as healthy without triggering a single false alarm.
If you are a clinical doctor sitting in an exam room with a patient who looks unwell, your biggest fear is missing the diagnosis and sending them home to die. Clinical medicine obsesses over sensitivity. You want a test that catches everything.
But when you move to population health, the priority flips completely. Public health experts obsess over specificity.
And the reason for that flip is a statistical phenomenon known as the positive predictive value trap.
Positive predictive value, or PPV, is the only metric the patient actually cares about.
Mm-hmm.
When the phone rings and the doctor says, your test result is positive, the patient's immediate question is, what is the actual percentage chance that I really have this disease?
The mathematical trap is that the PPV is not a fixed quality of the test itself. It is entirely dependent on the background prevalence of the disease within the specific population being tested.
I want to walk through the textbook's example of this because it is staggering.
Right.
Let's look at screening for beta thalassemia.
Okay.
Imagine we have developed an incredible screening test with 100% sensitivity. It never misses a true case. You deploy this perfect test in a high-prevalence setting, say a specific clinic in London, serving a demographic where the genetic trait is common.
Because the disease is common, the test performs beautifully. The vast majority of positive results are true cases.
But if you take that exact same physical test, still boasting 100% sensitivity, and you deploy it as a universal screening tool in a low-prevalence geographic area where the disease is exceedingly rare.
The mathematics completely collapse. In that low prevalence population, the positive predictive value of that exact same test plummets to 1.3%.
1.3%.
Hold on, let me make sure I'm synthesizing this correctly. You have a test that catches 100% of the sick people. But because the disease is so rare in the general population, a positive result only translates to a 1.3% chance that the person is actually sick.
That is correct. The math dictates that for every one true case of beta thalassemia you manage to detect, the radar is generating 99 false positives.
You are systematically informing 99 completely healthy families that their child likely has a severe, life-altering genetic blood disorder.
The psychological carnage of that is unimaginable.
The immediate anxiety, the terror while waiting for confirmatory testing, the invasive follow-up procedures.
Not to mention the sheer financial and logistical strain on the healthcare system required to urgently investigate 99 terrified, completely healthy patients for every one actual case.
This is exactly why public health demands specificity. When you are testing millions of healthy people for a relatively rare condition, even a tiny 1% false positive rate will completely overwhelm your medical infrastructure with phantom patients.
It is a systemic hazard. This is why, before a public health body ever turns on the microradar, a proposed screening program must pass a grueling gauntlet of criteria.
The gold standard framework for this was established in 1968, known as the Wilson and Jungner criteria. They form the absolute ethical bedrock of population screening.
What are the primary hurdles a program has to clear under Wilson and Jungner?
First, the condition must be an important public health problem. Second, the natural history of the disease. Exactly how it develops from a latent phase to a declared symptomatic disease must be thoroughly understood.
Third, there must be a simple, safe, precise, and validated screening test acceptable to the population.
And crucially, there must be an effective, agreed-upon treatment available.
It is fundamentally unethical to screen a population for a severe degenerative disease if medical science offers no way to alter the course of the disease once it is discovered. You are merely inflicting early dread.
And beyond the clinical criteria, there is an immense economic analysis required. When the public thinks about the cost of a screening program, they usually just picture the unit price of the cheek swab or the blood vial.
The physical test is merely the tip of the economic iceberg. The true cost of population screening lies in the massive, unseen infrastructure required to run it safely.
If you test 1 million people, you must build and maintain flawless IT fail-safe systems to track who was invited, who complied, who needs follow-up, and who is lost to follow-up.
You have to employ an army of quality assurance personnel to monitor lab standards.
And you must budget for the immense downstream costs of counseling, elective treatments, and surgical biopsies for every single person who tests positive, regardless of whether it's a true or false positive.
This connects to a concept the textbook calls the knowing-doing gap, which I found incredibly insightful. Often, a health department will want to launch a massive new screening program to show they are taking action on a specific disease. But the textbook warns against this reflex.
Because it is often an illusion of progress, the knowing-doing gap highlights that before you spend billions hunting for hidden, asymptomatic cases, you must look at your existing symptomatic pathways.
If patients who actively present to their doctor with obvious symptoms of the disease are currently experiencing delayed diagnoses, poor treatment, or administrative bottlenecks, launching a population screening program is disastrous.
You must optimize the clinical management of the visibly sick before you initiate a program designed to flood the system with thousands of newly discovered asymptomatic cases.
We need to wade into some darker waters here. Section 2.4 of our outline deals with the ethics, eugenics, and governance of screening.
Screening is not simply a neutral medical procedure. It is a highly charged political and social act.
Every dollar a government allocates to screening perfectly healthy people is a dollar directly diverted away from treating currently sick patients. It is a zero-sum debate over resource allocation efficiency versus equity.
Furthermore, any discussion of systematic population screening must acknowledge its darkest historical shadow. We cannot ignore the history of the eugenics movement, particularly its horrific state-sponsored manifestations between 1933 and 1945.
The foundational concept of utilizing state medical interventions to catalog, control, or improve human hereditary traits led directly to unimaginable atrocities.
Because of this profound historical trauma, modern screening, particularly genetic and antenatal screening, is governed by the strictest imaginable ethical frameworks.
So what does this all mean for the actual governance of screening programs today?
It mandates that informed choice is the paramount, non-negotiable principle. Consider antenatal screening for conditions like sickle cell disease or Down syndrome.
The structural goal of these public health programs is absolutely never to pressure a decision, influence population genetics, or attempt to eradicate a condition.
The sole ethical justification for the program's existence is to provide prospective parents with accurate, neutral information, empowering them to make an informed choice that aligns entirely with their own personal values and circumstances.
Even when programs are launched with the best of intentions and strict ethical oversight, they can still become politically dangerous.
The textbook introduces a concept by researchers Raffel and Gray called the popularity paradox. This is one of the most counterintuitive, fascinating phenomena in public health. Harming people actually makes the program more popular. How does that work?
The popularity paradox dictates that the more a screening program overdiagnoses harmless anomalies, the more fiercely popular it becomes among the public. Let me explain the mechanics of it. Imagine a screening program that utilizes a highly sensitive test.
Okay.
It frequently detects tiny, slow-growing cellular abnormalities. Now, the natural history of these specific abnormalities is that they would never, ever have caused the patient any clinical harm. They would have naturally regressed or remained dormant for the patient's entire natural lifetime.
But the radar spots it anyway.
The radar spots it, flags it as a disease, and initiates treatment. The patient undergoes surgery or a course of radiation to remove an anomaly that was never actually a threat.
However, the patient doesn't know that. That patient genuinely believes that the screening program found a lethal cancer and saved their life. They identify as a survivor. They form highly emotional, deeply committed patient advocacy groups.
That is incredible. Because the test was essentially wrong, it caught something harmless and subjected the patient to unnecessary medical trauma. It creates an army of loyal defenders who view the program as miraculous.
Exactly. And this creates an absolute political nightmare. When independent epidemiologists eventually review the data and realize the program is causing massive overdiagnosis and doing more harm than good, it becomes agonizingly difficult to shut the program down.
Politicians are faced with town halls full of tearful constituents demanding, "This program saved my life. How dare you try to defund it?"
The textbook cites two historical examples of this paradox in action. the Japanese neuroblastoma screening program in infants, and the Carlsberg Brewery's mandatory chest X-ray program for their employees.
Both programs were wildly popular, and both were eventually proven to be actively harmful.
The X-rays were subjecting healthy workers to unnecessary cumulative radiation exposure.
The neuroblastoma screening was catching embryonic tumors that almost universally regress on their own, which led to infants undergoing severe, entirely unnecessary abdominal surgeries.
And in both of those historical cases, it took years and sometimes decades of relentless, unbiased, independent research to finally break through the emotional advocacy and convince policymakers to halt the programs.
It is the ultimate proof that screening programs require robust, external, independent governance, completely insulated from the clinical departments running the tests or the political bodies funding them.
Let's round out our exploration of the microradar by looking at how screening changes across the lifespan. The radars we use for newborns look very different from the ones we use for adults.
In newborns, we use blood spots to screen for conditions like PKU, cystic fibrosis, and sickle cell.
But when we transition to adult screening, which is predominantly focused on catching cancer, we run headfirst into two massive statistical illusions that confuse both the public and clinicians: lead time bias and length time bias.
These biases are critical to understand because they explain how a cancer screening program can look phenomenally effective on paper, while in reality, it is failing to save a single life.
Let's start by dissecting lead time bias.
Imagine a hypothetical patient who naturally develops an aggressive, currently incurable cancer at age 60. The cancer remains silent until age 65 when symptoms appear.
They are diagnosed, and despite treatment, they tragically die at age 70.
From the moment of diagnosis at 65 to death at 70, their survival time was 5 years.
Okay, that's the baseline scenario without screening. 5 years of survival post-diagnosis.
Now, implement a screening program. The microradar catches that exact same cancer early, when the patient is 60. But remember, the treatment for this specific cancer is ineffective.
The natural biological progression of the disease remains unchanged, and the patient still dies at age 70.
So the screening program didn't extend their life by a single minute. They still died at 70.
Correct. But look at the statistics the program will publish. Because they diagnosed the patient at 60 instead of 65, the survival time from diagnosis increased from 5 years to 10 years.
The screening program will issue press releases claiming they doubled the survival rates. But it's an illusion.
They didn't increase the patient's lifespan. They merely increased the amount of time the patient lived with the terrifying, agonizing knowledge of their impending death.
That statistical mirage is lead time bias.
That completely changes how you have to read medical press releases. It's a staggering illusion. What about the second one, length time bias?
Length time bias is an illusion created by the varying growth rates of tumors. Cancers are not uniform. Some are highly aggressive, fast-growing, and rapidly lethal.
Others are indolent, incredibly slow-growing, and may never actually threaten the patient's life.
Now, consider a screening program where a patient is tested once every 3 years.
Mathematically, that test is much more likely to catch the slow-growing tumors, simply because those tumors exist in the body in a detectable pre-symptomatic state for a much longer window of time.
Exactly. If a highly aggressive tumor develops, grows rapidly, and kills the patient within an 8-month window, a test administered every 3 years is highly likely to miss it entirely.
These are known clinically as interval cancers because they emerge lethally in the interval between scheduled screenings.
Therefore, the screening program systematically filters out the aggressive, lethal cancers and predominantly detects the slow-growing, relatively safe tumors.
Precisely. And because the program is inadvertently selecting for the least dangerous cases, the overall survival rate of the screen group looks absolutely phenomenal.
But again, it's an illusion born of selection bias. The program appears highly effective at improving survival, but in reality, it's just really good at finding the cancers that weren't going to kill the patient anyway.
To put the sheer operational reality of cancer screening into perspective, we have to look at the data provided by researcher Angela Raffel on cervical cancer screening.
This is widely considered a highly successful, necessary, and vital public health program. But look at the sheer scale of intervention required to achieve its goal.
The numbers are sobering and essential for understanding the weight of the microradar. Statistically, to prevent a single death from cervical cancer, public health infrastructure must continually screen 1,000 women for 35 years.
Out of those 1,000 continuously screened women, over 150 will receive a false positive or abnormal result, inducing significant psychological anxiety.
Over 80 of those women will be referred for invasive clinical investigation, such as colposcopy.
And over 50 will undergo actual physical excision treatments on their cervix.
All of that massive, decades-long public health effort, the anxiety, the invasive procedures, the colossal systemic cost, is required to successfully prevent one singular tragic death.
It is a profoundly crucial life saved, but it perfectly illustrates the central thesis of our discussion. You have to move mountains of healthy people and accept a massive amount of collateral anxiety and overtreatment to find and neutralize that one hidden hazard.
Which brings us to the fundamental lesson of both chapters. Whether you are engineering the atmosphere to prevent a heat wave or swabbing 1,000 patients to stop one cancer, public health is ultimately about managing risk on a massive, complex, and deeply imperfect scale.
Let's tie the two halves of our deep dive together into a final synthesis. The overarching theme here is that the macro environment inevitably dictates the micro risks.
The shifting weather patterns outside determine who presents with illness inside the clinic.
Here's a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you continue your reading. We explored how climate change, the macro radar, is pushing tropical disease vectors, like the mosquitoes carrying dengue and malaria, further north into temperate high-income nations.
Simultaneously, we explored how our population screening programs, the microradars in those same nations, are highly sensitive, mathematically rigid systems heavily balanced for low-prevalence environments.
So what happens when these two radars inevitably crash into each other? How will our highly sensitive, micro-focused screening programs handle a sudden, massive influx of entirely new pathogens?
When the global climate shifts, the local radar has to be completely recalibrated. What happens to the health economics and predictive values of the global north when the endemic diseases of the global south suddenly become their routine everyday screenings?
The atmosphere isn't just changing the weather. It is about to completely rewrite the baseline blueprints of our entire healthcare system.
It is a profound systemic challenge, and addressing it will require exactly the kind of critical, upstream, cross-disciplinary reasoning we have been dissecting today.
All right, before we let you go, we're going to lock this knowledge in with some rapid learning reinforcement. We have 6 single best answer style recall prompts.
I will ask the question, we will pause briefly so you can retrieve the answer in your head, and then we will deliver the answer and the specific textbook chapter reference for your continued study. Let's do this. Prompt 1. Without the presence of greenhouse gases, what would the average temperature at the Earth's surface be? Take a beat.
Below freezing, specifically around minus 15 degrees Celsius. For a deeper dive into planetary radiation balance, revisit Chapter 2.8.
Prompt 2. In population screening, what statistical measure is predominantly determined by the prevalence of the disease in the targeted population? Take a beat.
The positive predictive value. To review the mathematical traps of screening in low prevalence areas, see Chapter 11.4.
Prompt 3. According to the WHO's Global Burden of Disease projections for 2030, which condition exacerbated by climate change will cause the highest number of disability-adjusted life years or DALYs in developing nations? Take a beat.
Malnutrition. The cascading health effects of agricultural failure are detailed in Chapter 2.8.
Prompt 4. What statistical illusion occurs when a screening program predominantly detects slow-growing, less aggressive tumors, making the program appear more effective at improving survival rates than it actually is? Take a beat.
Length time bias. For the critical distinction between length time and lead time bias, review Chapter 11.4.
Prompt 5. What is the popularity paradox in the context of screening programs? Take a beat.
It is the phenomenon where the greater the harm caused through overdiagnosis and overtreatment, the more people there are who falsely believe the program saved their lives, making the program wildly popular and politically difficult to stop. This concept is explored in Chapter 11.4.
Prompt 6. When comparing the 2003 and 2006 European heat waves, what public health principle primarily explains a dramatically lower mortality rate in 2006 despite similar temperature spikes? Take a beat.
Adaptation, which includes the implementation of early warning systems and structural preparedness. The mechanics of secondary prevention in climate events are found in Chapter 2.8.
Here are the details of this episode.
The environment and climate change. Byline. When the atmosphere becomes a determinant health in a warming world,